Hey Faith Family, welcome to the Beyond Sunday podcast at Calvary Bible, where we go beyond the Sunday sermon to explore some rabbit holes and to bring some biblical truths to the surface. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. All right, Calvary Bible Church, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to join you, and thanks for tuning in. We're back at it, another week here.
Yes, sir.
So I told Austin I had a joke for him this week. That's the curveball. It's a curveball for all of you because I am not a comedian, but I heard this the other day and it's my kind of humor. So,
I've been dying to hear it, so please tell.
So Austin, did you hear about the guy who took the free IQ test?
No.
He took the free IQ test on the internet and then he paid for the results.
Wow.
He failed.
Wow. Wow, that's clever. Sounds like something I'd do.
I've never seen any IQ tests like that on the internet, but you know what? I don't even click on that stuff.
I would like to know what my IQ is, honestly.
Me too. I don't.
I'd be curious to know. Actually, yeah, I don't know if I'd want to know.
Yeah, that's the
but
truth.
Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know where do IQs range from?
I have no idea.
I can tell you what I can't even tell you what my SAT scores were.
I do. I know mine.
What?
Enough to get me into Lancaster Bible College.
Seth Wagner just told me the other day that LBC's acceptance rate is 96%.
Yeah.
So
what are you trying to say?
Yeah, it doesn't take much.
No, it doesn't. No,
I got in too. Word of Life Bible Institute. I think their acceptance rate is probably 99%.
Right.
I think you have to actively be have a felony against you to not get in.
I think your testimony is probably more important than your SAT scores to get into that Word of Life.
It might be, yeah.
And your criminal record.
Goodness. All right. Well, anyway, let's dive into the meat of the podcast here, because jokes are fun, but that's not why we're here. We're here to just kind of tease out the sermon from Sunday, and so actually, real quick, we actually got some questions for last week's sermon after we recorded it.
Okay.
So I'm going to save them. So there's one or two questions that came in. So I'll save them for Randy.
Nice.
When he comes back. It was revolving around Jesus destroying again.
Okay.
Jesus saves and destroys.
Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, that's good.
You've been buffing up on your hymnal this week?
A little bit, working on it. Yeah, I was ready for a curveball like that this week, but I didn't get it. So
no, I got nothing for you.
That's fine.
All right, so Austin, I'm gonna pass it off to you. What do you got?
Yeah, so I got some questions for you, just in terms of the sermon yesterday. I think the first one was I was looking at the title of the sermon, and it was called "The Gospel Doesn't Bring About Enough Change," and so I was curious, just in terms of thinking through, what brings about that thought, or how does that kind of mindset set in?
Why is that something we have to contend with?
Right. Yeah.
That's a good question. Actually, real quick, before I give my quick thought to that, just to review where we were. We were in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, but the thought generally was, what is the gospel? And one of my goals in that sermon was to expand our definition or our understanding of the word gospel.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to expand what it requires to be saved, but I think that we misuse the word gospel. We don't misuse it. We just don't use it in its fullest context. We both say, I've heard you say it, and I've said this phrase, the good news of the gospel, which, because the word gospel means good news, we're saying the good news of the good news. And so just remembering that everything that happened throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, and then specifically with Jesus, that's news. It happened. So news transforms us. And is what happened good news? And if it is, then it affects positive change, and that's what Jesus did for us in his life, death, and resurrection. So that's just if you weren't with us on Sunday, obviously you can go back and listen to the sermon, but that's just a quick recap. But the question, why is that something we have to contend with?
Yeah.
I think that one stat was alarming to me, that almost 50% of regular church-going 18 to 29-year-olds would say that Jesus has not deeply transformed their life, which means the good news hasn't affected them. And so I think we contend with that thought, or that someone might say something like, the gospel, it's not for me. It doesn't do enough for me. It hasn't changed anything. It's just not impactful enough. One of the reasons we contend with it is because there's way too many people who consider themselves Christians, and it's just, not all that important to them. They're, if it fits into their schedule, great, but it's not the highest thing on their schedule. One current pet peeve of mine is youth sports. It's a pet peeve because we've got kids in sports. So let's play that out for just a minute. And, you've got 10, 11 kids on a team, and you need 10, 9 or 10 to play. If it's soccer, it's 11. If it's baseball, it's 9, whatever. And so if you have a game on Sunday, or a tournament that happens to play through Sunday morning, tournament schedulers and directors, they started scheduling that stuff on Sunday mornings because Christians stopped going to church and started prioritizing sports over sports. And I mean, I think so. Just in our household, the rule is church comes first, because that's where the good news is. That's so important to us. And will there be an exception to the rule? Maybe someday. There might be a time where it's a high school level or higher level championship game that happens to fall on a Sunday, and you know what? Okay, we'll make that decision that day. But these tournaments and sports teams, you have this sense of guilt, like, oh, I don't want to let my team down, and no one's going to notice if I'm not at church. Maybe someone will, but it's not that big of a deal. I'll just miss a Sunday or two. And all of a sudden that becomes easier and easier to do. And it's a slippery slope. So, I think when the outside world looks at Christians and they don't see much change, not much of a difference, and then they think, well, why would I even be interested? That's not intriguing to me, because they don't understand how beautiful it really is.
Right. Yeah.
That's my not so quick answer.
Yeah, that's good. And I think one of the things that I wrote down for the last point was the fact that believing in the gospel should change the way we live. Obviously that, I feel most people would agree with that and be like, yeah, that's an easy statement. But it's the gospel is radical. And so in order to, if we say we believe the gospel, putting our belief in that should change the way we live. And that goes back to what you were saying of the good news changes the way that we live. So the gospel, we can't believe the gospel and be the same as we were before we accepted the truth of the gospel. And so that was just something that I made me stop and think, and then even looked inward at my own life and was like, okay, I'm someone who says that I have accepted the gospel. Yeah. And so is there evidence of a changed life because of the gospel's work in my life? And so that was just something that I was, kind of reflecting on at the end of your sermon on Sunday. So
yeah, it has to change us. If it doesn't change us, then the first point was it's just trivia.
Yeah.
It's just advice, and I think that's the difference between news and not news. And if it's just someone's advice or just someone's opinion, well, then that's all it is. You know what I mean? But this is the Gospels. The 4 Gospels they're the story of Jesus's life. It's not advice. It's something that happened, that after which point something entirely new is possible. My life, there's something that's now possible because of what Jesus did that was not possible before he lived, died, and resurrected. And so.
Right. And I was going to say something off that. Don't remember what it was. It was there.
It was
Oh
good.
no, I know what it was.
Go.
Yeah, it came to me.
Yeah.
So actually, you started off the sermon with
Mhm.
some type of question of, it was, when you hear the word gospel, what's the first word that comes to mind?
Yeah.
And I was in the front row, and I almost said Jesus, but I didn't. And then
Yeah.
you went on to elaborate how the good news of the gospel is Jesus. And I think one of the reasons why I was
Yeah.
thinking that was because for the youth group on Wednesdays, we're teaching through Luke.
Okay.
And so I was reading through Luke chapter 1 and 2, and
Mhm.
you have the part where Jesus is, being dedicated at the temple, and Simon comes up and he's like, prophesying over baby
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah.
And he's like, this is, he's holding salvation.
Mhm.
So it's not like Jesus is just, one aspect of salvation. It's
Yeah.
like he's literally holding salvation in his hands.
Yeah.
And so like just going back to the fact that, when you were talking about the gospel of Luke or the gospel of John, it's
Yeah.
the life account of Jesus, because it's Jesus himself who is that salvation, who is the good news.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is kind of getting back to what you were talking about.
You're right. And I mean, the word gospel it's such a good word, but I think in a lot of ways it's gotten like overused. Like you'll hear the
Right.
terms like gospel driven and gospel centered, and we do want to be those things. But when words can get thrown around and they become like junk drawer words where just everything kind of falls under them. But in this case, I think it's actually the case where the word gospel has been used so narrowly to what someone needs to know to become a Christian, that the other parts of the good news
Right.
have been kind of left out of the news part of it. Do you know what I mean? So when we say, did we talk about this already on the podcast? The good news of the gospel?
Yeah, I think we did a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't remember if it was before we started recording or after. So yeah, it's when I say gospel, I immediately I think of, okay, what are the bare essentials that someone needs to know
Right.
to be saved? But there's more to the news than just that also should change us.
Right.
So,
and actually, we were talking about before the podcast the Tim Keller quote that you shared on Sunday.
Yeah,
and I couldn't remember all of it, so I didn't write it down, but I remember thinking that was really helpful. And so I think you have part of it,
memorized. It's not memorized, but essentially the meat of it was the gospel is the declaration of Jesus's rule and an invitation to come under Jesus's good rule.
Right.
So the news is Jesus is in charge.
Right.
He's in power. Our God reigns. And to think about the gospel of Caesar and the gospel of Jesus and how they are conflicting good newses, right? Two different sets of news. Caesar's in charge or Jesus is in charge for Paul, right?
Right.
And so for those first century Christians, which good news is going to be the one that changes them, right? And so for us today, Jesus is he's still in charge. He's on the throne, and my life should be different because of it.
Right.
My life ought to reflect his life too. And I think that too was something that kind of dawned on me through the week in my study is the life of Jesus in the Gospels. The life of Jesus often gets little attention, less attention than his death, burial, and resurrection.
Yeah.
And his life also should change us as well. Believing Jesus's miracles isn't a part of my salvation. But believing Jesus' miracles should still change me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think one of the reasons why I like that quote so much was just because they got at the part of like, we have heard the good news of the gospel. There, I just said it. Good news of the gospel. It's easy. Yeah, it's easy to say.
And it's not wrong.
Right.
But it's, if that's the only way we ever use it, then we're forgetting some of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just, it's like we've heard the gospel, and so what are we going to do with that good news? I think was one of the reasons why I was liking that, because like the end is like the declaration of.
Yeah, we're inviting other people into this too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's good news.
Mm-hmm.
The world that we live in is broken and just so messed up.
Mm-hmm.
But there's going to be a day where all things are going to be made new and right. And I'm looking forward to that day more and more and more. Yeah,
I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, for some reason, even when you're talking, I keep going back to what I was sharing earlier of like the gospel changes us, and it's like we would all agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like for some reason I just keep going back to the fact that like I can't have an interaction with the gospel. Like I can't, accept the gospel and not be changed. And I know we talked about this earlier, but for some reason my mind just keeps going back to that. It's like if I stuck my hand into our fire pit and pulled it out, my hand would be burnt. Yep. All right. Because the interaction that my hand had with the fire changed. Like it wouldn't be possible to stick my bare hand into a fire and have it not be burned.
Yeah.
So it's like, I can't say, I believe, like I can't have an interaction with Jesus Christ and the gospel and not be changed from that. And so I think that's just one of the things that makes it so beautiful. And that goes back to like, the heart of your message was like the gospel changes. The good news of the gospel changes us. And so I think, go back to the title, if the gospel doesn't bring about enough change, it's like, the understanding of the gospel is wrong there because the gospel changes lives.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Yep. It's got to.
Right.
News changes.
Right.
Things. Did you have another question?
Yeah. So the other question that I had, and I'll propose it.
Did.
Yeah, and I'll propose it. I was gonna wait close to the end. But the question that I was asking myself, and I'll kind of propose it to everybody who's listening and to you, was we were talking, like me and you were talking before this podcast too about good news and how like we should be putting our hope in the gospel. And so one of the questions that I was asking myself was like, what are some other gospels or good news things that I seek to put my hope in? And so I think I was just wrestling through a couple of things while I was thinking, through that question. Because I think there's other things there's other news or gospels that I can find hope in other than the truth of Jesus Christ.
So I think ask the question without the word gospel and just use the word news. So what news do you get excited about, or what news do you have hope?
Right.
Do you put your hopes in?
I would say honestly, like for me, I've kind of joked about it, but in a lot of ways, like I'm a huge Penn State football fan.
Yeah.
And so, I can put my hope in the news that I hear from Penn State football. They're doing really well, playing great football. But at the end of the day, if they have a bad game or they lose, my emotions can be affected by that. And, I'd say for some people, maybe it could be things like politics, of what they're hearing in the news of politics, or what they're hearing in the news in terms of sports, or whatever it is. I think there is multiple answers to that.
Yeah.
But
well, I think I think you're I think you're right. Like in those things, they affect us. They engage our emotions. We talked about on Sunday, we schedule our day. We hang on every word, whatever the news is. So I think sports is something that a lot of people can, get ramped up about. Politics, you mentioned that word. If your party's, not in power, you're really hoping that next time, next election season, that your party gets into the White House or into the governor's office, or what school board for that matter. I mean, you know what I mean? Like that is good news, and it's okay to have other, I think, good news, affect us.
Right.
When Penn State wins, that makes Austin happy.
That's right.
Right, and that's not a bad thing. It's not an unchristian thing. It's not like the only thing in this world that we're to enjoy is just, the Bible and talking about the Trinity and, whatever. There's other things that happen that we should enjoy. So Penn State's one of them for you, and politics can be something for somebody. And sure, you have a set of beliefs and values that line up with a political party. And when that political party gets in, you're happy about that.
Mm-hmm.
You're excited. You feel like, okay, there's some hope here for my country or my city or whatever. Yeah. The danger is when those things become more important than the good news of Jesus Christ. Right. Or even on a smaller level, like the news. Let's say your kids come home from school. I don't have any kids yet, but your kids come home from school and they've got good grades. Yeah. That's good. How does that, if your kids get bad grades, does that bring you down?
Yeah.
And so the ability to just kind of keep an eye on your heart
mm-hmm.
and say, what things are bringing me up and down, and are they bringing me up and down too much?
Yeah.
Like when my kids came home and, if they were flunking out of classes, I wouldn't be happy about that.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't destroy me either.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if Jesus doesn't raise from the dead, or he doesn't live the life he lives, that's going to change me.
Right.
So I think to just remember that we've got news that it's constantly happening. And news that happens on a small scale has a smaller effect. News that happens on a large scale has a larger effect. And I think one really just amazing thing about the scriptures and Jesus is that it really happened on a small scale, but it's just continued to grow.
Right.
Like, the mustard seed.
Yeah.
It just keeps expanding.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here's this, 30-year-old Jewish guy who's crucified on a cross as a criminal. And, the prophets, Romans talked about the prophets, talking about in the Old Testament, the scriptures, the writings, just talking about him. And so it's this really somewhat small scale, but it just keeps just flowing out.
Right.
And it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful.
It is. It is. And we ought to invite others into that too.
That's exactly right.
I think just for my own evangelism, it's a good reminder that I'm inviting someone into and under, like Keller's definition, I'm inviting someone under Jesus's rule, and it's good rule, and makes evangelism a little less scary.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and the same thing would be, it's not us who's changing lives. It's the gospel. So that gives me a peace too when I think about sharing my faith with others. I'm not the one who brings about the change and saves somebody's life, but I can put my hope and trust in the gospel, which has the power to save.
Mm-hmm.
So
that was a few weeks ago. John 6:44, God who calls. So the pressure's off of us.
Right.
It's an unsettling doctrine, but the pressure's off of us evangelistically, and that's good too.
Yeah.
So that's good news.
That is. That is good. That is good news.
All right. Got any questions? Or you out?
I think I'm out of questions. That's mostly what I had.
All right, good.
So
yeah, awesome. Well, those are good questions. Thanks for bringing them.
Yeah.
And you guys can always email your questions to podcast@cbcmj.com. We'll flesh them out. And if this episode happens to bring up any questions and you want to follow up, just shoot an email to that email address, and we'll flesh it out next time. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Sounds good.
See you guys.
Yep. See ya.
Thanks again for joining us on today's episode. And remember, our Sunday sermons are meant to lead us to a life of worship beyond Sunday.